everybody. I'm Professor Meredith. I'm a professor in the Department of Religion and Classics. And even though I'm on the religion side, I teach the religion of the ancient world. So I have many classes such as healing in antiquity, Jews, pagans, and Christians, about religious conflict antiquity, and the body in early Christianity, about gender and embodiment and personhood in the ancient world. And those are all cross-listed with classics. And I would be delighted to see any of you in any of those classes. But today I'm going to be talking about the subject of the Roman persecution of Christians and how the evidence that we have presents very different views from the Roman perspective and from the Christian perspective about the intensity of that persecution, the frequency of that persecution, and the meaning of that persecution. So were Christians really thrown to the lions or not? I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, which you're going to be seeing on the screen, and that PowerPoint is going to be available in the folder that you have on Blackboard, as will this lecture. And then you'll also have a couple questions that I'll insert into the lecture for a little bit down the road for you to respond to in the discussion section. Because I'm doing this by means of a lecture video, if you have any questions, feel free to email me in the department, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, since we can't do a question and answer period after you view this lecture. Okay, so as far as I know, I think you've learned about the activities that went on in the Colosseum: games, gladiatorial competitions, public judicial punishments by various means, including being killed by wild animals. And for a lot of people who aren't studying the ancient world, the primary way in which we might know about these kinds of activities that occurred in the Colosseum or similar arenas around the Roman Empire is due to the fact that among those killed by the Romans in this way were the early followers of Jesus, the Christians. And in their own ancient texts, Christians repeatedly and extensively wrote about the experiences that they had of Christians who they present as having been specifically singled out by the Romans for their religious beliefs or terrible persecution. This belief that there was widespread, intense, and consistent persecution of the Christians by the Romans has come to dominate the popular understanding of the relationship between the Romans and the earliest Christians. And throughout history, Christians develop this idea, cultivate this historical memory through storytelling, through worship practices, through art of various forms, and it persists to this day, which you can see here in these political cartoons. Now, before we start looking at the evidence specifically for the Roman persecution of Christians, I want to step back for just a few brief minutes. I don't want to assume that anybody knows anything about Christians or the Jesus movement, and just talk about a few salient points. The Jesus movement began as a very small movement of Jews in the Roman province of Judea in the early part of the 1st century CE. Jesus was a Jew born in a very small village of Nazareth that had maybe 300 houses, very small, no evidence of city planning, far away from the seats of power. We know next to nothing about Jesus's life before he began to travel around as a preacher and a teacher and a healer in the small towns and villages of the northern parts of the Roman province of Judea, which is called the Galilee. He gathers a very small group of followers around him who travel around with him. They come to be called the disciples. And what is he teaching about? He's teaching about a lot of things: about caring for poor people, about caring for the sick and the marginalized in our community, about the proper interpretation of Jewish law, about the interpretation of the Jewish Bible. But from the perspective of the Romans, when Jesus and his teachings and his followers eventually come to the attention of those in power, the most troubling part of Jesus's teaching is that Jesus repeatedly claims that in the near future, a new kingdom is going to be established, and the current social and political order, the Roman Empire, is going to be turned on its head. Now, Jesus was not the only Jew who thought this. Many Jews were hoping for a restoration of their kingdom. They believed that they had been given promises of sovereignty by their God. They're waiting for their Jewish kingdom in their promised land to be restored, and that a king from the line of David would rule over their land. Roman control over the territory of Jews, their financially oppressive system of taxation, their control of the population was all antithetical to the Jews' theological and political conception of themselves as a people who should be sovereign in their own land as God's chosen people. Jesus's followers start to believe and to claim that he is going to be this king, that he is descended from David, and he's going to be the one who's going to establish this kingdom and overthrow the Romans who are occupying the Jewish territory, the Jewish land, and occupying the Jewish people. So during Passover, people would travel to Jerusalem, Jews would travel to Jerusalem in order to make offerings at the temple and to celebrate the holiday. Thousands of Jews from all over Israel and the empire, they would travel to Jerusalem. It's a busy, chaotic time. Roman soldiers would be there. There'd essentially be crowd control. And it's during this week that we're told in the Gospels that are in the New Testament that Jesus and his followers come to Jerusalem and make a disturbance in the square outside of the temple, and he's arrested and put to death by means of crucifixion for the crime of sedition, of rebellion, of being treasonous, of preaching the overthrow of the Roman Empire and the establishment of a new kingdom. Now, the crucifixion of a rebellious foreigner was a typical, not a singular event from the perspective of the Romans. Many Jews, many people were crucified by the Romans. But eventually, when crucifixion comes to be central to the followers of Jesus and to their understanding and their development of Christian theology and religious symbolism, people come to believe that Jesus's crucifixion was in some ways unique or a distinctive event. But it really wasn't. The Romans put to death many people, as we discussed, by means of gladiatorial shows or throwing people to wild animals or crucifying them. They had all sorts of forms of capital punishment for people who were troublemakers, who were criminals, who were rebellious in various ways. It was a typical rather than a singular event. And to Roman ears, sayings of Jesus like, "I came not to bring peace, but a sword," and the talk of the imminent establishment of a new kingdom sounds like fomenting rebellion, sounds like seditious activity. So Jesus is put to death. And so to some extent, the followers of Jesus experienced persecution from the very beginning. And it is indeed true that some Christians were killed by the Romans in the following decades in gladiatorial contests or by being thrown to wild animals, also for the crime of sedition or rebelling against Rome. But the perception that the Romans were specifically seeking out or hunting down Christians, or that there was widespread, frequent persecution and the merciless putting down of thousands of Christians being thrown to the lions, is a very distorted misunderstanding of the evidence. So let's look at that evidence, and let's also look at how that perception of Roman oppression of Christianity and the martyrdom of early Christians emerged and came to be. So we'll be asking, were Christians really thrown to the lions? How widespread was persecution? Why did they persecute? Why did persecution become so central to Christian self-definition? And what are the ramifications of this belief that develops that Christians were widely and specifically singled out by the Romans for persecution? What's the actual evidence that we have of Roman persecution of the Christians? From the perspective of the Romans or non-Christian sources, we have very few pieces of evidence. And the evidence that we have are sort of incidental or really just passing references to Christians. And we'll be looking at some of those. We have the earliest sort of substantial piece of evidence that you'll see itself reveals that the Romans don't even really know that much about the Christians is Pliny's letter to Trajan that occurs in about 112 CE. But generally, we don't have very many. It's not a matter of note for the Romans. Let's put it that way. But we have extensive, lengthy sources written by Christians in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, which center martyrdom as a key feature of their experience in the Roman Empire. We have texts that scholars call apologies. An apology is not what we think of, saying that you're sorry, but it really means a defense. So rhetorically, these Christian apologies are ostensibly defenses directed towards the Roman emperor or people in power to say, like, hey, we're not a troublesome group, quit persecuting us. And then the other major source that we have are Christian martyrologies, accounts of martyrdom. And they tend to be very dramatic and very theatrical. And Christians wrote many martyrdom accounts, and they would tell these stories again and again. And the rhetorical effect is clearly to excite sympathy as well as identification with the Christian martyr. And these become central for early Christian self-definition. So on the one hand, Romans are hardly noticing this activity, yet for this nascent, brand new religious group that's emerging in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the experience of persecution becomes central to the formation of their collective group identity. Let's begin by looking at the Roman evidence. And so here we're going to look at a couple passages from the work of Suetonius, a historian of the Roman Empire from the late 1st, early 2nd century. He has two kind of stray references to the followers of Jesus. And I think they'll show to you how, in a way, sort of unimportant to some extent these references are, and how little note of this new movement somebody like Suetonius makes. These are just references in passing. So here we have a passage from Suetonius's Life of Claudius, the lives of the emperors, and he's talking about various actions that Claudius has undertaken in order to ensure the sort of unity and integrity of the Roman Empire, and how there's different groups that they've conquered, and each of these different groups has their own quirks and problems. The Lycians have all these internal feuds. The people of Rhodes have various former faults, all these various different kinds of faults. You've got the people of Ilium, and how are they going to treat them? So he's listing how they're going to treat them. And finally, you get to this reference at the end, and it says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Now, this is a fascinating reference because, first of all, the Jesus movement did begin as a Jewish movement. It very quickly breaks away and becomes a non-Jewish or Gentile movement. But from the perspective of the Romans, they don't know anything about this movement. They just know vaguely that it's connected to Judaism, that it's associated with the Jews, that it came from Judea. Furthermore, they don't understand the name of Jesus. Christos is a title. It really means Messiah or anointed one in Greek. Here, they don't understand that. They think this is just a name, and they've misspelled it, Chrestus, with the US ending. If you think about it like Marcus or Julius or Claudius, right? It has that sort of masculine ending. And so here you just say that apparently, from the perspective of this historian or from the perspective of Claudius, this group of Jews were making disturbances at the instigation of a figure named Chrestus, and so he wants to get rid of them in Rome. But you can tell he doesn't really, this is a kind of persecution, kicking them out, expelling them from Rome, but he doesn't have any knowledge or understanding of who they are or what they believe or anything like that. It's just they're being disruptive. So just like there's nothing particular or specific. This is a list of how this emperor has dealt with a range of different kinds of groups that are now part of the empire and under the control of the emperor. Our next reference is found in the life of Nero, and it has to do with the very eventually we'll see it has to do eventually to do with the very famous fire of Rome. And it's talking about various punishments that Nero gave out to people. It says, during his reign, many abuses were severely punished and put down, and no fewer new laws were made. A limit was set to expenditures. Public banquets were confined to a distribution of food, the sale of any kind of cooked viands, and in the taverns was forbidden, with the exception of legumes and vegetables. Whereas before, every sort of dainty was exposed for sale. So this is just various different rules. He's trying to create some more discipline in the city of Rome. And then he says, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. So, and then he goes on, he puts an end to the diversions of the chariot drivers, pantomime actors, etc. So once again here, one of the things to notice is Christians are not being singled out. There's a whole bunch of disciplinary actions that Nero is taking towards the populace. Christians are not being uniquely singled out. You'll see that in the Christian narrative, Christians often like to present themselves as being uniquely singled out. The other thing to notice is that he refers to Christianity as a superstition. What is this word superstition? Well, it comes from the word superstitio. And for the Romans, it refers to beliefs and practices that are both foreign as well as novel to the Romans. Now, there were all sorts of religious traditions that were categorized as superstitious by the Romans. The religion of the Celts, the customs of the Egyptians, even among the Jews. The Jews were superstitious. So, for example, Tacitus writes, among the Jews, all things are profane that we hold sacred, and they regard as permissible what seems to us to be immoral. Judaism is perverse and degraded, and they, the Jews, are prone to superstition, and they're the enemy of true religion. Right? That's because Romans were mystified by typical Jewish practices, such as observing the Sabbath, or refusing to eat pork, or circumcision. But in general, Jews were left alone because they were not novel. They might be foreign, they might be strange, but Romans recognized the antiquity of the Hebrew Bible, the antiquity of the Jews, that the Jews existed as a people and worshiped their gods even before the inception of Rome. And for that reason, they may be viewed as a superstition, but they often had special rules that they wouldn't be required, for example, to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. The problem for Christianity was that once it separates and people start to realize that it's not a form of Judaism, but that now it's a new separate religion, that it's a new religious movement, well, then this brings this notice of novelty to the Romans. And in matters of religion, the official stance of the Romans was fairly conservative, and they were suspicious of innovations, mistrustful of new religious ideas and practices. The primary test of truth in religious matters was custom and tradition, the practices of the ancient, the mos maiorum, the ancestral customs and norms. Christianity was not only foreign and strange, perhaps like Judaism, but they were also a new movement. And so it's viewed as a superstition, and so had to be sort of watched and restrained, but just like any superstition would have to be. The next piece of evidence that we're going to look at is from Tacitus, another historian. And Tacitus here is also talking about Nero and about his activities. And he's not particularly a fan of Nero in this passage, but he describes for us what happened to the Christians in the 60s in Rome. And I'll just read this aloud. You can follow along on the slide. But all the human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and all the propitiations of the god did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration, the fire in Rome, was inflicted as the result of an order. Right. The rumor is going around that Nero started the fire in Rome himself to clear the way for him to build a palace. So consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace, right? So he decides to scapegoat. He wants to get the focus off of him. He wants to dispel the rumor that he started the fire so that he could clear some way for his new imperial palace. And so he decides to scapegoat Christians. It says Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here they know a little something now. Tacitus knows a little something about this figure, still doesn't quite understand the nature of the name Christus, but nevertheless knows that this is a movement that follows this figure. And it says, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all hideous and shameful things from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So the idea is that here you had this movement that started under the figure of Jesus. Pontius Pilate rightfully had him killed, had him crucified, but nevertheless, this superstition took hold and started to spread. And it even spreads to the big cities because you can always find this kind of corruption in big cities. But then he continues on and he talks about what happened, that Nero orders the arrest of all of these Christians. And then it says, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. And then they started naming names and many, many people started to get arrested. But it said they were convicted not so much of the crime of setting fire to the city, which was the whole thing to begin with, but rather hatred against mankind. This notion that Christians hate other people who are not them. This idea that Christians are insular and misanthropic was an idea that probably emerged out of associating them with Jews. In antiquity, there was a stream of Greek and then Roman, and you see it also among Egyptians, of anti-Semitism because Jews, for example, because of their kosher food laws, they wouldn't eat with other people or they wouldn't intermarry. This notion that they were misanthropic and xenophobic. And so Christians were viewed this way as well, even if it wasn't actually true. Jews live in and among people all throughout the Roman Empire. Then it describes their punishment. So here we finally are getting a discussion of the punishment of persecution. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. So it's not enough just to kill them. It has to become a spectacle, an event. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn apart by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses and were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. And Nero opens up the grounds of his palace. It's in the circus, but also in his palace. And he himself is walking around and people are being set on fire. And it's all part of this kind of spectacle of punishment. Now, it's interesting because Tacitus steps back and he said that this level of punishment excited sympathy from the populace because people thought, well, even though these are hideous people, for whatever reason, they don't really seem to know. They seem to have only the barest knowledge of them, but rather that it was being done to satisfy Nero and Nero's need for a scapegoat. So what we're seeing here is from these few little sources that we have, and I'm not keeping any sources back from you. These are the sources that we have, these few little disparate mentions that suggest that Romans were somewhat aware of the Christians and that they were viewed as an unusual, strange group associated with the Jews, but not really fully understanding them. But that clearly Nero understood that they were a marginal enough group that they could be safely used as a scapegoat. But typically they're listed among a group of other people who are considered to be undesirable or other groups that are viewed as problematic. There's nothing singular or particular or widespread. This event of Christians being killed ostensibly for setting the fire, but really because they're being scapegoated. This is a singular incident that affected a few people in the city of Rome. It's terrible, but it's not empire-wide. It's not widespread persecution. It's not singular. It's not particular to Christians. The fact of the matter is that most Romans don't know anything about Christians, but they're viewed as kind of self-righteous outsiders. Christians claim to be in exclusive possession of veritas, of the truth, and they denied the very existence of the Roman gods. From the Roman perspective, we have some writings in which Christians are viewed as atheists because they don't recognize the gods, but they're just viewed as this odd group, a superstitious group, but there are many such odd groups. There are many such strange groups. So the notion that in the first century Christians are being singled out is not accurate, and it suggests that there was a widespread campaign against Christians, and there really seems not to have been one. Even Tacitus recognizes that Nero's persecution of the Christians was unwarranted, that they may be a weird group, but that they're obviously being scapegoated. So the persecution of Christians was local. It happened in Rome. It was local. It was brief. It was not widespread. It was not part of a systematic, widespread policy. So then the question becomes, well, does it ever become part of a widespread imperial policy to persecute the Christians? So in order to discuss that, I want to shift gears a little bit and to talk about the imperial cult for just a moment. So even though we don't see a widespread policy of persecution, we have to ask, was there ever such a widespread explicit policy of persecution of the Christians? And this brings us a little bit to the reign of the Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96. There has been some debate among historians about whether or not Domitian developed an official policy of persecution of the Christians during his reign. The evidence for Christian persecution under Domitian comes entirely from Christian sources, and later Christian authors refer to the time of Domitian as a time of persecution. But it doesn't seem, indeed, as if he has an explicit policy of persecution. But what Domitian did do is he was very interested in animating and revitalizing what comes to be called the imperial cult in order to shore up civic loyalty and unity throughout the empire. So what did it mean to participate in the imperial cult, and why do Christians refuse to do so? The imperial cult involves offering sacrifices to the gods of Rome and to the goddess Roma herself in order to secure peace and prosperity for the emperor and the empire. The idea that proper worship of the gods by the citizens of the empire was essential to get the favor of the gods and to ensure their security is widespread. And so as the ritual practices involved in the imperial cult, as they developed, you start to see that it begins to incorporate the worship of the past emperors of Rome. After their deaths, some of the emperors were deified and became gods. And although technically participation in the cult doesn't require the worship of the living emperor, it does require citizens to make sacrifices to the emperor's genius, or spirit. And so the requirement to participate in the imperial cult caused Christians problems. But as long as because they could not swear an oath, they argued, to somebody outside of Jesus. Now, as long as they were not distinguished from the Jews, they were not forced to bring the required sacrifices to the Roman emperor and to Rome. Romans generally recognized that Jewish monotheism prevented the participation of Jews in the imperial cult. And as I said, they respected and acknowledged the antiquity of the Jewish tradition and Jewish monotheism, even though they had other critiques of Judaism as a strange and odd movement. But Christians, once they break from Judaism, no longer have the protective and necessary component of antiquity on their side to protect them. They were seen as a new religion. Also, they were dedicated to the worship of a man who had been executed on the crime of sedition, the charge of treason against the Romans. So their Christian continued unwillingness to participate in the imperial cult was interpreted as a sign that they were treasonous too. Because basically Romans feared that the refusal of great numbers of people to worship the gods would bring disaster of all sorts upon the empire. And one church father, Tertullian, talks about this view. He says they, the Romans, think that the Christians are the cause of every public disaster, of every affliction with which the people are visited. If the Tiber rises high as the city walls, or if the Nile does not, if the heavens give no rain, or if there's an earthquake, if there's a famine or a pestilence, straight away the cry is, away with the Christians, Christians to the lions. The idea was that Christian, as members of the empire, their refusal to participate in the imperial cult could have ramifications that would disturb the sense of security that Romans deserved from the gods. So the reasons why the Romans insist upon participation of all in the imperial cult is the very reasons Christians can't do so. The distinction between religion and politics, between church and state that we might take for granted today just simply doesn't apply to the ancient world. Both the Romans and the Christians believe in an integrated view of a religious and political worldview. The gods are securing our political, our geopolitical, military and cultural and social safety. So for the Romans, participation in the imperial cult was seen not only as a sign of devotion to the Roman gods, but also simultaneously to the Roman state and the authority of the emperors. They're inextricably intertwined. But Christians, they can't separate the two similarly, and they've pledged their allegiance, including their political allegiance, to Jesus, to Christ. In a very famous martyrdom account, a Christian named Spiritus is being interrogated, and he's asked by the Roman official to, quote, swear an oath and take an oath by the genius of our Lord and Emperor. And Spiritus, the Christian, replies, I do not recognize the emperor of this world, but rather I serve that God whom no man has seen or can see. I recognize my Lord, the King of Kings, and the Emperor of all peoples. Right? So he can't do it. So some people have argued that not because Domitian specifically was against the Christians, but rather an unintended consequence or a consequence of his promotion of the imperial cult meant that those who refused to participate or to opt out of participating in the imperial cult, this becomes a way in which the Christians become visible and known to the community, and therefore could be possibly targeted for persecution. To some extent, this is all speculation, but it definitely is. We don't have, for example, records under Domitian of decrees going out against Christians or of there being increased persecution of this particular group. We don't have any of that in Roman sources, but we do have Christian sources saying that persecution ramped up during this period. The final Roman piece of evidence that I want to look at is Pliny's letter to Trajan and Trajan's response. Pliny, who was active at the end of the second century, the end of the first century and the beginning of the second century, he was a provincial magistrate, and he wrote hundreds of letters to Trajan, and they corresponded on a number of routine administrative matters. And so I want to give you one kind of example where basically Pliny writes to Trajan asking, can we form a volunteer fire brigade in the region? And Trajan replies, and you can read his reply here on the screen, but basically Trajan replies and says, look, obviously you need to develop a system for putting out fires, but don't allow them to form a kind of society or a club. He says, remember, societies like these, which have been, remember, it has been societies like these, which have been responsible for political disturbances in your provinces, particularly in its cities. If people assemble for a common purpose, whatever the name we give them, and for whatever reason, they soon turn into a political club. So provide them with equipment, etc. Give them everything they need to be able to deal with fires, but don't allow them to form some sort of official club because it's inherently going to become political. So we can read from this letter, this is just about a fire brigade, that Trajan is very concerned about groups forming, groups and societies forming, because when people assemble and get together for whatever reason, it's going to quickly become a political club. And we'll see that this is part of the concern that when we read Pliny's letter and Trajan's response about the Christians, that one of the key things is that, look, we just don't want them to associate together and to cause problems. But it's the same as true as for a fire brigade. It's not particular to Christians. So let's look at this letter together. So Pliny is writing this report and this request to the Emperor Trajan around the year 112 AD. And he's basically writing because what's happened is he's been dealing with Christians, but too many now are coming to his notice, and he's been killing them. But too many of them have been coming to his notice. And so he feels like he can't just act on his own now, and he wants to get some advice. But he also says that he doesn't quite know what he's doing. He argues that he's brought them in. He says that he brings them in and he asks them various different kinds of questions, but he's not really sure what it is that he is punishing them for. He basically says, what if they're young people? What if they're really old people? What if they just recently became a Christian or just are kind of interested in it versus somebody who is a full-fledged, outspoken member of this movement? Why are they being persecuted? Do Christians engage in any kind of crime? Christians themselves often complained about this and referred to this as being punished for the name. They haven't done any kinds of crimes. So then he says that he goes ahead and he's brought people in to interrogate them, and he gives them repeated opportunities to recant their Christianity, and threatens them with capital punishment. And he says if they still persevere, then I order them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their creed, I could at least feel no doubt that stubborn and inflexible obstinacy deserved chastisement. So he basically says, look, I don't even know what I'm punishing them for, but they're being stubborn. So I go ahead and I order them for execution. And then he says, but those who deny that they were or ever had been Christians and who are willing to repeat after me an invocation to the gods, to the Roman gods, and they offer adoration and they pour a libation of wine and they burn incense to your image. He brings in a statue. He basically offers a litmus test to these people who have been accused of being Christians. He says, because and I asked them to curse Christ because I've heard that Christians can't do any of these things. And if they're willing to do those things, then I let them go. So that's kind of a weird crime. If your crime is that you're a thief, and then you say, okay, well, maybe I was a thief, but I'm not going to be a thief anymore, we wouldn't necessarily let you go. But as long as they're willing to kind of give token response that they're not Christians and sort of demonstrate this through participation in an imperial cult ritual of offering incense and wine and a prayer to the statue of the emperor, to the Roman gods, and cursing Christ, then they'd be let go. Doesn't know what Christians are in, what practices that they're engaging in, and frankly, he doesn't even really care. He says that he even went so far as to torture some people. He found some women who were not citizens, who were slaves, so that he could torture them. And he said, but I could discover nothing more than a depraved and excessive superstition, right? This is just some weird, novel, foreign, strange religious belief. It doesn't necessarily seem to be posing any problem, but just inherently, it's a problematic group. So, but too many people are being called to account, so he doesn't know what to do, and he just wants to get some backing from the emperor. And the emperor writes back and says, fine, go ahead and proceed as you have been proceeding. If people recant, let them go, no matter how guilty their past behavior seems to be. He also says, don't take anonymous accusations. Don't allow people to name names and to use the accusation of Christianity to get people in trouble. But what can we conclude from this? Trajan doesn't seem to be particularly concerned. He's just like, yes, deal with this issue. They don't seem to know anything about Christianity, right? It's just a generic troublesome group, just like there were many, many troublesome groups. So when we think about this is all the evidence that we have. We don't have any evidence of widespread persecution of Christians or even notice or awareness of the Christians from the Roman perspective. They paid little attention to Christians and Christianity for decades. The Christian movement is a very small movement. Also, they seem to have a don't ask, don't tell kind of policy, right? They're not going to seek you out. Trajan says, don't seek them out. Don't take anonymous accusations. As long as you're not being a rabble rouser, as long as you're not causing trouble, then we're not going to seek you out. There are no general policies of persecution. Any persecutions seem to have been sporadic and local, not regular, not consistent, not frequent, not widespread. And their concerns are really political. Are you in somehow being seditious? Are you against the Roman Empire? And Christians are constantly saying, we're good citizens, but we're just not willing to take an oath. And if you think about it, what is it the governments want? They want the sort of the widespread performance of rituals of civic loyalty. Right. And we feel that way in our own country. People get upset when kids refuse to do the Pledge Allegiance. People get upset when athletes, for example, are not showing the proper respect to the flag or to our national anthem. Right. So we have also our own shared sociocultural anxiety about people who are resistant to our civic public rituals of allegiance, just like the Romans are. We've had those kinds of controversies. So it doesn't seem as if there's a widespread policy of persecution or that the Romans are particularly concerned with the Christians more than they would be with any other group that they might view as odd, strange, or potentially troublemaking. So one of the things that we have to realize is that historically, we have very different lenses through which we have access to these experiences of persecution and martyrdom. And they reflect very different perspectives and understandings about what exactly is happening. From the Roman perspective, the story of Christian suffering is generally recounted as an incidental accounts of minor set of skirmishes with unruly subjects. And in fact, for many, many decades, it's a story that doesn't even merit being recorded or noticed. For the Christians, however, the story of Christian encounters with the Romans becomes a narrative that is imbued with cosmic meaning, in which their oppressors become demonized and take on the resonances of evil. So for Romans and Christians, the experiences of the killing of Christians is understood and given very different meanings. So let's turn now to, in fact, Christian sources. So let's look at Christian sources. In particular, let's look at martyrologies, which paint a very different picture. In Christian martyrologies, the suffering Christian is placed at the center. The entire tone and framing of the persecution is that it is a single instantiation of an ongoing cosmic kind of battle. Christians are presented as being actively hunted down by Romans. Romans are presented as inherently kind of bloodthirsty and are deliberately and specifically seeking out Christians in order to kill them in the most brutal, spectacular, and public fashion possible, including being thrown to the lions or being forced to participate in gladiatorial contests. So Christians develop the category of martyrdom to understand their experience. And they conceptualize Jesus as the first martyr. The word martyr essentially means witness, You're witnessing to your faith through your willingness to die for it. Basically, this theology of martyrdom and the theology of thinking about Christian suffering at the hands of the Romans also emerges out of the theological problem of theodicy. How do we think about the fact that God's chosen ones, ostensibly, are being made to suffer? If it's indeed the case, Christians would ask themselves, that we and we alone understand the nature of the one true God as it has been revealed to us through Jesus, whom we worship as the Christ, and God is all powerful, how can we possibly understand why God is allowing Christians, his own people, to suffer so terribly? So, in order for martyrdom to emerge as a theological category, the violence and the suffering of persecution has to be infused with particular meanings. So, the development of a theology of martyrdom by the Christians can be understood as one form of refusing the meaninglessness of death itself. It can be a way of refusing to allow the dominant party, in this case, the Romans, to define the meaning of the act. It's their way of dealing with troublesome members of the populace. Instead, Christians want to redefine that event as a central battle in a kind of cosmic war. By turning the experience of being legally killed by the Romans into martyrdom, by reframing what is essentially an experience of powerlessness into one of power, Christians are able to reassert the priority and the superiority of their longed for order, and it idealizes a system of meaning, their religion and their longing for justice. Therefore, it's not simply in merely the act of being killed that martyrdom emerges, right? Many people were killed. Many Jews were killed by the Romans. Many people were killed by the Romans. So it's not merely the act of being killed, but it's in the telling and the retelling of the stories, in the creation of the memory of the martyrs, that martyrdom and persecution become early emblems of Christian identity, despite the fact that statistically, not that many Christians were actually being killed. And that's what we have in these accounts of martyrdom. They were not written at the time, but by later Christians who used the relatively rare and infrequent occasion of Roman killing of Christians as a jumping off point for an emerging and developing a sense of Christian identity that is focused on the experience of martyrdom and persecution and disempowerment. Christians who had come to believe that they had replaced the Jews as God's chosen people had to come to terms with persecution and suffering. They had to develop other modes of explaining why it was that God was allowing them to be persecuted and killed, and modes of interpretation to give the very real and intense physical suffering and bodily pain that was the experience of martyrdom, to give that experience meaning. And they do so by writing martyrologies in which they work out their theology of martyrdom and suffering. So what are the theological ideas that we see reflected in martyrologies? The first idea that we see that pervades all the martyrologies is what's called imitatio Christi. Jesus was killed by the Romans. Jesus was killed for who he was. And we are being given the opportunity to imitate Jesus, not just in his care for the poor and the sick and those who are imprisoned and those who are downtrodden and marginalized, but also in his death. So the martyrdoms, however they occurred, tend to be reframed and to kind of be retold through the lens of Jesus's own death. And the martyrdom accounts make this explicit. Quote, in the martyrdom of Polycarp, it says, quote, for nearly all the foregoing events of the martyrdom came to pass that the Lord, might show us once more an example of martyrdom which is conformable to the gospel, right? So that we too may become imitators of Jesus, right? We are martyrs just like he is. His death valorizes our own suffering. Jesus suffered, Jesus died, and this is part of what sanctifies him. And so we too are suffering and dying and being essentially a kind of sacrifice, and we too are sanctified through that. Another way in which they come to conceptualize the notion of their experience of martyrdom and to give it meaning is to situate the experience as part of an ongoing and all-important cosmic battle, right? The idea is Romans might think that what's going on is just sort of a judicial dealing with problematic citizens, right? How do we deal with these citizens? But Christians recognize that this is in fact a cosmic battle. Romans might not realize this, but Christians do. And so you see constantly that Christians conceptualize and imagine themselves as fighting not against the Romans, but against Satan, against the forces of evil, against the devil. So you'll see various, you can see on the slide here, various quotations about how it's Satan who's punishing them. It's Satan and the devil who are torturing them. And he says, I realized it was not wild animals that I would fight, but it was the devil. That it's Satan who is, that is punishing them. This enables the Christians to valorize their experience. They're not just the poor victims of Roman judicial punishment, but rather they are these heroic martyrs who are fighting in this grand cosmic battle of good against evil, of God against the devil. And they are standing firm against the forces of evil. Now, the Romans are not reading the event that way. They're hardly even noticing this figure. But for the Christians, this becomes a central way of conceptualizing their relationship to the world and their relationship to the Romans as a place and a site of embattlement, and not just a local kind of battle or a local struggle, but a cosmic battle. Christians also, in demonstrating, part of what they needed to demonstrate was that the martyrdoms were all part of God's plan, right? Because you'd be asking yourself, why is God allowing the people who are worshiping him properly? Why is he allowing us to be tortured and killed? Well, not only are we imitating Christ, and not only are we part of this cosmic battle, but we also Christians start to develop the idea that those figures who are willing to endure that kind of torture, that they have a special closeness with God, that they are particularly sanctified. And so the martyrs start to become revered. There's always this period of time in martyrdom accounts where they've been arrested and they've been sentenced to death, but they're awaiting the next day, the next time of gladiatorial contests or at times in the circus where they're going to be thrown to wild animals. And they'd be in prison and people would visit them, or martyrs would write about their visions, and beliefs developed that in a way, as a reward for being willing to imitate Christ, even unto death, that they're given a special status for God, that they're going to immediately be taken up into heaven, and that therefore they have a special connection to God. They could intercede on your behalf. The martyrs come to become the earliest first saints as people who could speak to God on our behalf. And one way, for example, just as a side note, that you know that the Romans are not going around trying to kill all the Christians, that it's not a widespread policy, is people are visiting, right? Christians are visiting Christians in prison. They're wanting to make them exemplars. They're wanting to make exemplary punishments so that people will stop being Christians as a deterrent. They're not wanting to kill all these citizens in their empire. They're just wanting this problematic movement to essentially go away. So in addition to to this imitation of Christ and this notion of inner cosmic battle, the martyrs get to experience this kind of exaltation, this special status, not only in this life, but they will in the heavenly life as well. Also, Christians are masters of paradox and inversion. Right? You can see that in Jesus's preaching, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that those who are in positions of power will be brought low, and those who are the meek and the poor and the suffering of the earth will be raised up. Well, this theology of inversion and this impulse towards thinking in paradoxical ways becomes central to the development of a theology of martyrdom, which has to deal with the reality of pain. And so, for example, in Tertullian's letter, he tries to write to the martyrs to suggest that they're so lucky. Like, yes, you're in this dark, dank prison awaiting your death, but lucky you, because that you are at least protected from having to walk around a typical Roman city in which you're going to see all these monuments to the false gods of Rome, all these altars or processions that might be happening, or holidays that are happening, or sacrifices that are happening in the forum, and so on. Right. So the idea is that you should be glad to be in prison because you don't have to deal with that. It's protecting you from that. Aren't you lucky to be isolated from the horror of what it is to be living in the non-Christian Roman Empire? And so we see, oops, sorry about that. There we go. You see, in fact, that this pain of torture, the pain of being burnt alive, of being torn apart by wild animals, it is described in positive terms. And there's a complete inversion around the experience of bodily pain and of judicial punishment in Christian writing. And you start to get the elevation of bodily pain as a marker of spiritual sanctity. This gets developed later on. Once Christians rise to power, they don't have the opportunity to prove what superhero Christians they are anymore. And so Christians start developing ascetic practices to bring about physical pain on their bodies themselves, because they no longer have martyrdom as an arena to show how much they're willing to imitate Jesus's suffering. So you start to get the development of the ascetic movement, and people who engage in fasting or self-flagellation or very bodily disciplinary behaviors as a way to engage in a kind of everyday sort of martyrdom. So there's a complete inversion, that it's wonderful to experience this pain and suffering, that that's in fact the sort of greatest glory. And they use that as a way to frame the experience and to imbue it with meaning. Another way that Christians imbue the experience with meaning is they live in the Roman world too. And so even though they are being forced to engage in gladiatorial contests and fight to the death, or being thrown to wild animals, they are able to co-opt that image of the gladiator and to represent themselves as gladiators. So the church father Tertullian, who was just talking about how great it is to be in prison, because then you don't have to see all the awful Roman gods and Roman festivals and Roman processions and so on. He also describes Christian preparation to meet their death as martyrs as similar to the training undertaken by gladiators. They're the most perfect gladiators, and they're fighting for a righteous cause rather than fighting for the emperor. Even female martyrs in the very famous martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas have visions of themselves as male gladiators, or they conceptualize themselves as gladiators. And furthermore, Christians begin to recognize that they too, like other gladiators, can earn notice and respect of the crowds by performing in an exemplary manner and displaying bravery and fortitude and a willingness to endure pain with equanimity, that they are exciting the admiration of the crowds. And perhaps by being exemplary figures, they might even excite the pity of the crowd, especially if you have young girls or new mothers. The crowd is essentially going to kind of turn against this use of gladiatorial type punishments or other forms of brutal capital punishment against the Christians. Also, the fact of the matter is many Christians themselves write that it's precisely because of the killing of Christians that the movement came into greater public view and that people even became aware of the movement. Right? The movement is not very big. It takes a long time for the movement to grow in terms of numbers, in terms of demographics. But when it starts to come to people's notice because, oh, why are these people being killed? Or why are these people being thrown to the lions? People begin to actually wonder and to question and to ask why are people joining this movement? Why are people willing to die for this movement? We have early Christian writers and thinkers talk about how the first time they became aware of Christianity is looking at how the Christian martyrs met their death with patience and with bravery and with equanimity, and started asking, oh, well, if Christianity is people are willing to die for it, and it gives you a faith that enables you to face this kind of pain and suffering with such equanimity, well, then maybe this is something worth living for as well. So the 2nd century Christian author Tertullian, again, he writes that the Romans did not realize that, quote, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, right? People, that the act of martyrdom or being thrown to the lions attracted notice to the movement and also eventually attracted admiration. The stories of the martyrs have captured the imagination of both the earliest Christians and of modern scholars, in many ways far out of proportion to their number. All our sources point to the fact that there were surely fewer than 1,000 martyrs killed, and likely only a few hundred. The martyrs represent a very small, kind of heroic minority. They don't represent a huge popular swelling of people who were killed. We don't have a widespread policy of persecution. We don't have Romans purposely seeking out Christians or hunting them down. Officially, Romans seem to take very little notice of Christians or Christianity. We don't have tens of thousands of people being martyred, but it seems that we do eventually start to have tens of thousands of people admiring those few who are willing to be murdered. But the influence of these acts of martyrdom then in shaping early Christian theology and practice, and shaping a popular and widespread view of the early church as heavily persecuted, and the experience and the self-definition of Christians as inherently a movement that experiences oppression and persecution from the very beginning. Jesus was persecuted, then the earliest followers are persecuted by the Romans. This becomes central to the story that Christians told about themselves and to some extent still tell about themselves. In the history of interpretation, the stories of martyrdom of the early church evoke strong feelings on both ends of the spectrum. On the one side, you have many people in antiquity and in the modern world who have viewed the martyrs with distaste, as being examples of overly zealous, irrational religious fanatics, as people who have a morbid pleasure in physical pain, as kind of masochists. Some scholars point to the fact that there's a kind of unhealthy reveling in recounting the physical tortures endured by the martyrs. And so that this is kind of a problematic and not necessarily admirable part of Christianity. But on the other hand, within the confessional tradition of Christianity, their martyrs are deeply admired for their bravery, for their ability to withstand brutal tortures, and they even worship themselves to some degree for their steadfast faith and devotion to Jesus. Right? The martyrs end up becoming conceptualized as saints. Now, eventually, the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity at the beginning of the 4th century and accelerates the process of conquering and converting the Roman Empire for Christianity. And the tables turn, and Constantine and later Christian emperors enact legislation to limit the legal rights of Jews and Roman polytheists and to limit their ability to practice their religion, just as the Romans sought to put limits on the religious practices of others in their empire. But even when they were in positions of power in the 4th century, in the 5th century, Christians continued to define themselves as locked in cosmic battle and to represent themselves to themselves as a persecuted people, and more specifically as a people singled out for persecution in the world. This formative experience of being persecuted by the Romans, even though it was sporadic and infrequent, became so central to Christian self-identification, early forms of Christian theology, early forms of Christian practice, that it comes to dominate the development of Christianity even long after persecution is at an end. And so you will see, if you read the history of Christianity, that each generation of Christians, no matter how powerful, has drawn on the language and the legacy of Christian accounts of Roman persecution and used this language and self-perception of persecution as a pretext for proactively and preemptively imposing restrictions and even committing violence on other peoples, on non-Christians, right? We were persecuted, so we have to make sure that that never happens again. Or you can see that, for example, in the common rhetoric that you might start hearing in the airwaves nowadays about the war on Christmas, right? That Christians are persecuted. You can't even be Christian anymore. This is not new rhetoric. This is ancient rhetoric. What we need to think about is how does that rhetoric sound? What is the effect of that kind of thinking and that kind of worldview when you truly are a minority group or a marginalized group or a disaffected group? That when you do attract attention of people in authority, you might be in positions of danger and even perhaps to the point of death. What happens when that group themselves become the most powerful cultural force, themselves have the power of empire, themselves have the power of the state behind them, right? They don't lose that narrative that enables them to continue to conceptualize themselves, as we saw way back in the very beginning, as a persecuted people. We can see that in these images way from the beginning. You see this book, for example, a modern book, So Many Christians, So Few Lions. Is there Christianophobia in the United States, presenting themselves as persecuted and conflating the experiences of contemporary Christians with Christians in antiquity. It is true that Christianity emerged as a small, beleaguered movement. And it is true that some Christians were thrown to the lions by the Romans, but they were not particularly singled out for punishment. They were not thrown to the lions in greater proportion than any other group that was conceptualized as problematic or viewed as criminal or potentially treasonous. In terms of absolute numbers, the prevailing perception that thousands upon thousands of Christians were gleefully killed by the Romans specifically for their Christianity or were hunted down by the Romans simply has no evidence to support it. All right, so that is, that is my lecture on were the Christians really thrown to the lions? And as a kind of proof that you got all the way through the lecture, please post to the discussion list an image of a lion. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you in future classes, and good luck with all your end of the semester work for this class and in all your classes. Thanks so much. Talk to you later.